Film Club.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Film Club. I'm one of your hosts, Andy Harrison. With me, as always, it's Andy Donaldson.
Now then.
Andy, every week in Film Club, we invite the lovely people at home along to watch a film with us, and this week we are taking a look at the 400 Blows.
The 400 Blows, which is one of France's classics, and it's about a young lad who I believe is kind of based on the director, François Truffaut. Probably mispronounced it. Truffaut, mispronounced it like that. Yeah, so it's about this young kid who doesn't have the best life. He just gets berated by his teacher and his parents. They don't really have the time for him. Like the start of the film, the first half, his mother's horrible to him. You know, he skips school, he steals. He's just not had the best kind of start to life anyway. So it's kind of like how he deals with everything. Very gritty, very realistic, and it's kind of a portrayal of coming of age kind of film.
It is. It's very much like it's about the teenage experience, and you're right, this is sort of based a lot on Francois Truffaut's own experiences, as well as like some of those of his, I think his friends, his family, sort of collective.
Yeah, I read that, yeah.
He's trying to make something that I guess encompasses an element of relatability. There's something about it that like everybody can pull from their own childhood. But as we mentioned at the beginning there, this is from the French New Wave period. Now, we went into French New Wave a little bit more in depth when we did our Breathless review. So I'll pop a link in the description below for anybody who wants to check that out. Do go and take a look if you want to go into French New Wave. But I'll give just a brief summary. This is a period where a collection of filmmakers in France were sort of making a response to the idea of American films coming over to France and sort of influencing their own culture. So desperately tried to make films that were intrinsically, they're counterculture. They're intrinsically French. They are baked into their DNA is the idea of what French experimentation is all about. And the 400 Blows was one of the first.
What a film it is. You mentioned how Francois wanted to capture a realistic kind of style, something that everyone can relate to. So I've got a few notes about this film, and I put like how realistic. It's none of this superficial Hollywood kind of experiences that gloss over everything. That kind of like that he's that way because of X. He's that way because his mum's left his dad, and like the whole cliche that build on. No, his mum's still with his dad. His mum's having an affair. That's not really brought on apart from the start of the film. It's really well done. Like the mum, which has a bad experience with him at the start, like she's not bothered about him. In the kind of middle towards the end, is a bit more concerned and kind of wants to try and love him, and then obviously have the end scene as well. It's like ups and downs of realism, and that is true to life.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about there is really interesting because he's actually portraying quite three-dimensional characters. There's a moment like towards the beginning when his mum has sort of like berated him for the first time when she's just got home and sent him back out for flour. That you encounter his dad, and his dad at first you kind of go, oh, he's going to be like the happy one. He's going to be like the light of the family. He's going to be maybe the glue that's holding them together. Blah 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 blah. And then it ends up with him being the one to leave, and he's the one that walks away from the family. And there's obviously you color the family with this additional element of like, well, actually, it's not even his dad, and actually his mum.
That was brilliant.
Almost like aborted him at one point, and.
That wasn't.
He lived with his grandma for a bit, and he didn't start living with his mum until he was 8. I think he said. I can't quite remember.
That scene was absolutely sensational.
Yeah, and
that was amazing.
It starts to paint these like three-dimensional characters. It definitely has fun with its more two-dimensional characters. I love all the stupid little like the back and forth and the bickering and the bullying going on in the kids' classroom, especially with like the one who's a suck up to the teacher, and he goes and like the one who sort of like basically tells on his parents that he skipped school, and they pass the goggles around and they smash them and stuff, and like it's just
I love it's a pair of goggles as well. Why goggles?
But you're right, it's so intrinsically real. Like everyone's got little stories that are sort of like about when their time at school, and those the sort of the nerdier kid who did something silly and everybody bullied him for it, or the time you skipped out in school and you panicked about like what note are you going to take your teacher, or like how are you going to get out of it? And the silly excuses that you make up, like, oh, my mum's dead, because he desperately wanted to get out of that situation. But it has this like consequence. And then like that moment, the sort of follow-up being that he's then humiliated in front of this group of his peers because he's being slapped by his father. Like, it's a film that isn't necessarily about a downtrodden child. It's a film that isn't necessarily about a child finding his place or happiness or anything about that. It's just about a child.
Yeah. There's a really good scene we're on about the realism as well. Like, just away from the main character, is the Punch and Judy scene where him and his mate, by the way, is class throughout this film. I love how much he looks out for him. For me, that scene doesn't need to be there, but I'm so glad it is, because that scene doesn't really give anything to the story, give anything to the character, but what it does give is it gives a sense of that realism, that this is what it's like in a day in the life of these people. Like, these kids are coming to watch French Punch and Judy. They're all kind of bewildered, they're all scared at points, and it's such a good scene to kind of give an idea of what it was like to be that age, and that kind of, I loved it. It has not really much to do with the main character. I loved it.
Can I give a bit of a retort to that? Because I did take something from that scene. That scene for me is the moment where the film starts to colour our main character as more of an adult. They put him into a situation where actually he's surrounded by people who are younger than him, and we no longer identify him as a child because they are the children, and it's him and his friend who are the adults in the situation.
I suppose they're taking his friends, what I assume his little sister, little brother, to the actual show. Yeah, so
it looks like they fucking frog marched that kid. It looked like they just picked him up off the playground.
Are you going to watch Punch and Judy French style?
There's a willingness in this film, though, to not necessarily explain everything, isn't it? There is a willingness to sort of let things sit. And this, that is part of what I guess French New Wave was motivated by.
I was a big fan of the music throughout this film. I can't particularly point out any piece, but it just had a really good style that bounced from one scene to the other, a lovely kind of classical kind of style that kept pace with as the film progresses. Didn't take you out, but at the same time didn't massively draw you in. There's some great cinematography in this film. The one scene I want to point out is when he's on that ride, that spinning round ride, and the camera's following, it's almost following the tracking of the pole in the middle whilst letting it spin round, but at the same time, it's also spinning round, facing everyone. That so good. Wasn't a great scene. That was a really great scene.
And that's one of those examples of giving you a feeling of what it was like to be a kid again.
Oh, mate, I loved it. I don't know if that's just a style of French New Wave, trying to be out the box, trying to be a bit post-modern.
Definitely is. It's that experimentation, that sort of like the French New Wave, the Cahiers du Cinéma. They were desperately sort of like trying to figure out what they could do with cameras and what sort of stuff. Every time the rule book told them to do something, well, they just simply asked, "What if we don't? What if we do something else instead?"
Which I love.
And if we want to talk about shots for a second,
mate, I know what you're going to say.
There's a shot which echoes back, or I guess echoes forward really, to a film that we've already covered in Film Club. We actually covered this in Shame. Again, I'll link it below if you want to take a look at it.
I've written it down.
Because it's the scene towards the end where he just starts to run. And
it's brilliant.
It's clearly something that would influence Steve McQueen. Sorry, I couldn't remember his name. It's a scene that would influence Steve McQueen at some point, because he does a wonderful version of it in New York.
Very much.
In the 400 Blows, this is basically the shot that kind of ends the film, really. This is the shot that has him finally sort of running away from escaping, just having some sort of physical expression of him moving away from his childhood, and brings him eventually to the sea.
I like it. It honestly, everything you just said there is what I've written down. Like the scene in Shame where he's walking through the streets in the opposite direction, whereas he's run long. The camera doesn't necessarily track him in the middle, but it goes forward a bit, it lags behind a bit, but it's also got him and his determination to go forward and see the sea, which is what he wanted to do. Fantastic. We'd be silly if we couldn't mention the cinematographer, who is Henry Decay, if that pronounced that right, Andy. But he was fantastic.
Given that it's French, I'm going to guess it is Henri Decay.
Yeah, not Henry, Henri. Oops. I should know that. Thierry Henry is a footballer. Oh, well. Me and my bloody pronunciations. He was fantastic though. He like absolute for me. The biggest thing I took from this, apart from the actual realism of the story, was that cinematography of the film. It was absolutely fantastic.
So, one last thing I want to
So-
mention before we wrap this up, because there's something about the 400 Blows that I actually didn't know until recently, and that is that this is the first film that Truffaut did with the star of the film, a guy called, the lad is called Jean-Pierre Lode, I think, Jean-Pierre Lode, maybe?
Who was fantastic, by the way. I can't believe I
he's-
didn't mention that. Sorry.
That's actually a great point.
He was
He is
amazing.
stunning. We talk about sort of how difficult child actors can be, lots on this show, and he
carried
did a
it.
fantastic job. But this is the first film in a 5-part series that he did, and
I
he
know.
would,
I did read this. I didn't know it was 5 parts, but yeah.
It is. He would revisit this pairing. He'd revisit this character with this same actor over the course
What,
of
a bit like
5
Boyhood?
years. A bit like Boyhood, and he'd do it over the course of 20 years. There's 20-year
hell.
difference between this and the 5th film, and every single time it just picks up with Antoine every so often and just sort of tells another chapter in his life. These aren't films that right now I've seen, but I cannot wait after watching this to start watching a little bit more and just over the course of maybe a couple of weeks, dropping in and sort of seeing how Antoine progresses every couple of years.
I'd like that. By that description, it sounds an awful lot like Boyhood, and we know how we felt about that. So, big fan.
So there is the 400 Blows. You can let us know in the comments below what you thought of the 400 Blows, or you can hit us up on Twitter, as always. But Andy and I will be back once again next week, where Andy has prepared a surprise because I don't know what's coming.
Yeah, so I figured kind of similar kind of style of film, but a British perspective. We're going to look at Kes.
I knew you were going to go with Kes. I don't know why, but I knew it. There was a whole thing as we were watching this. I was thinking, this feels like kitchen sink realism. This feels like we're heading towards Kes. I cannot wait until
Me
next
either.
week. Get watching.
Cheers, guys.